Thank you so much. So, thank you, everyone. So, just like the title of my presentation indicates, I'm going to mainly discuss what is the nature of the so-called nominative case in Paiwan and also in many other kinds of literary languages. And I'm also going to mainly discuss what kind of interactions this so-called nominative case can make with the relativized minimality. So before moving on to the main content and the core argument, the core question that I'm going to discuss in this presentation, I'd like to introduce some assumptions about the case assignments in Paiwan language. So as we can see in these two examples, and like many other kinds of Australasian languages, Paiwan regularly shows these kinds of agreement relations between the types of the voice markers and the theta rules of the so-called nominative subjects, as you can see in these two examples. On the other hand, in the case of the non-nominative external arguments and the internal arguments, they are basically regularly assigned with these kinds of genitive case and oblique case, respectively. And I think we can understand these kinds of genitive case and oblique cases as some kinds of cases that are assigned by the T head and the small v head, respectively, to the external arguments and to the internal arguments, respectively, via the traditional and standard agree operation that we usually assume in the standard version of minimalist program, just like in the case of the English nominative case and the accusative case that are also assigned exactly the same way. So this is the first assumption that I would like to make. The reason why we need this kind of assumption is because in this way we can clearly account for example, why this external argument must be assigned with this kind of genitive case unless it's marked in nominative. So this is the first assumption that I would like to make. The second assumption that I'd like to make is about the nominative case assignments. And as we can see in this structure, I would like to assume that the voice markers, so-called voice markers in Paiwan, are actually some kind of special kinds of T head and the small v head that contain the nominative case to assign. So for example, if a voice marker is introduced at this T head, then it will assign the nominative case to the external argument via the agree relation. And it will be, the voice marker at T will be spelled out as the actor voice, not because it agrees with an agent, but because it carries the T categorical feature. On the other hand, if it's introduced at the small v head, it will assign the nominative case to the internal arguments, and it will be spelled out as the PV because it carries the small v feature. So this is the second assumption that I'd like to make about the nominative case assignments. The reason why we need this kind of second assumption is because otherwise, for example, if we have only a single functional head like this voice that assigns this kind of nominative case, then we cannot actually account for why the voice markers can agree with the theta rules of the so-called nominative subjects. For example, let us suppose we have this kind of voice marker. Let us suppose it now has to assign this nominative case to the internal argument. So then this internal argument will have to undergo some kind of movements to this position because of this locality problem. Well, even though this kind of additional movement is not that welcomed in the minimalist program, but let us suppose that is possible. Then this kind of internal arguments will be assigned with this kind of nominative case. So it will be spelled out as the subject of the whole causal spline. But even if that is possible, this internal argument actually cannot value the phonetic form of this voice head as the patient voice, because by the time this internal argument is assigned with the patient theta rule at LF, the phonetic feature of the voice head will already have been spelled out to the PF. So because of this reason, in other words, because the PF and LF cannot communicate to each other, the phonetic form of the voice head actually cannot see what kind of theta rule the internal argument is assigned with. So because of this reason, if we assume this kind of structure, we actually cannot account for why they seem to agree to each other, because PF and LF are two different kinds of interfaces, they cannot communicate to each other. However, in this kind of system, we can account for why they seem to agree to each other. For example, in the case of this AV, it will be spelled out as AV because it carries T at the phonetic form. But on the other hand, at the same time, this external argument will be interpreted as an actor or the agents simultaneously at Aleph. Even though they are interpreted in two different kinds of interfaces, respectively and mutually independently, as far as they are interpreted in this way exactly at the same time, they seem to agree to each other. So in this way, if we assume this kind of assumption, we can account for why we have these kinds of agreements between the voice markers and the theta roles of the so-called subjects, even if the PF and NF cannot communicate to each other under the standard assumption of the minimalist program. So these are the assumptions that I'd like to make, but what is actually more important is if these kinds of assumptions are on the right track, then what is the nature of these kinds of voice markers in a nominative case? So that's the core question that we have to ask. So in other words, what's the conceptual necessity of these kinds of features and these kinds of constituents? So that's the core question to ask. So in order to solve this kind of question today, I'm going to suggest this kind of structure with these kinds of arguments. So first of all, I'm going to argue that the relative phrase in Paiwan and also in many other kinds of Australasian languages is strong in that it's always present there at the clausal left periphery of the whole clausal spine, as we can see in this structure. But because of this reason, it always requires for some kind of relative argument to be interpreted at the relevant position, because it's a rel. My second argument is about the nominative case. I'm going to argue that the nominative case is actually a relative feature that is accidentally assigned by one of the voice markers to one of the arguments that we have in the VP layer, just like we have seen in the last slide. This is argument number 2. And my argument number 3 is that even though this nominative case, which is a relative case, is supposed to be interpreted at this relative position, it does not actually undergo any kind of A-bar movement. Instead, it just stays in situ, thanks to the presence of this kind of covert relative operator that is basically generated at the spec position of the rel P. So because of this reason, it can stay in situ. This is the third argument that I'd like to make. So in other words, I'm going to argue that the voice markers and the nominative case are actually the optimal solution for the requirements of this strong rel P in Australasian language. So this is the core argument that I like to make. So in the following slides, I'm going to introduce my supporting ideas one by one about this and about why we need to assume this kind of rel P basically at every matrix clause. So I think we can start from the properties of the nominative argument. So in Australasian studies, the nominative argument is often referred to as topic. And actually, this topic is not quite identical to those kinds of topics that we see in the cartographic approach that are basically definite and also function as the center of attention. So in other words, basically the so-called Australasian topics are definite. They basically don't function as the center of attention. So also from the perspective of cartographic approach, again, the topics are basically believed to be recursive, so we can have multiple topics at the same time. But in the case of the so-called Australasian topic, it's basically not recursive, so we can have only one nominative subject per clause. But interestingly, rel Ps or the relative operators are basically not recursive, so we can only have one relative operator at maximum per clause, just like the case of the nominative subjects. And the relative operators are basically definite. They basically don't function as the center of attention, just like the nominative case, according to various kinds of previous studies in the information structure. And the relative operators can bind many kinds of constituents like the external, internal, and even applicative arguments, just like we can assign the nominative case to all these kinds of arguments almost freely as far as the agreement relations are kept. So therefore, if we have to compare the relative operators and and the topics from the perspective of the cartographic approach, then we must say that the Paiwan or the Australasian nominative argument is actually more similar to the relative operators rather than to the topics. But one may ask if relative phrases can ever stand alone as an independent clause, and like it's a matrix clause. But cross-linguistically speaking, we actually already have some examples of relative clauses that can stand alone, and especially when they are a positive relative clauses, as you can see in 6. So cross-linguistically speaking, some relative clauses can stand alone as a matrix clause, as you can see in this English example. And even though they are embedded, as we can see in this example number 7, they are still interpreted as if they are independent matrix clause. And we can prove this because this embedded positive relative clause actually does not contribute to the truth condition of the whole clause. So in other words, we can cross-linguistically say that some relative clauses are both syntactically and semantically independent. So in other words, we can also expect some kinds of independent matrix relative phrases also in Australasian languages. And we can also see quite an interesting pattern about the relative clause and the matrix clause in Paiwan. So simply put, in Paiwan, we can use directly the matrix clauses as some kinds of heavy internal relative clauses, as we can see in this example number 8. So in other words, this bracketed embedded clause is actually a relative clause whose head is embedded within the relative clause, as you can see. But if we crop this relative clause out of this sentence, then it can just stand alone as a matrix clause. So in other words, the boundary between the matrix clause and the relative clause is a bit opaque in Paiwan, and this is also the case in many kinds of Australasian languages. And also, if we have to account for this kind of head internal relative clause, we will have to assume some kind of covert relative operator at the left periphery of this embedded relative clause, just like the structure that we are arguing for now. And also, the fact that in principle the relative heads must be the nominative arguments in Paiwan and also in many other kinds of Australasian languages also supports our idea about the relations between the nominative case and the relative phrase. And even though they are not actually Australasian languages, we can also see quite similar patterns also in Japanese and Korean. So in these two languages, we must have the so-called about this topic, which are usually positioned at the clause initial position and marked with this kind of wa particle in the case of Japanese, as you can see in this example. But interestingly, this about this topic is actually not recursive. We can have only one about this topic per clause. So because of this reason, even if we have multiple wa particles constituents like this, the highest wa constituent is exclusively interpreted as the about this topic. Any other kind of second or third wa particles constituents must be interpreted as the contrastive constituents. So because of this reason, we can prove that the about this topic in these two languages are not recursive, just like the Australasian nominative subjects. And more interestingly, if we have any kind of wa particles constituent like this embedded within relative clauses, interestingly, we can never interpret them as the about this topic, even if they are actually the first wa particle constituents that we can see in the linear form, which implies that the presence of this kind of relative operator is suppressing the availability of the about this topic of this embedded clause. In other words, this implies that also in these two different kinds of languages, the about this topic and the relative operators could be basically rated at the same position, which is the spec rel P position. And just like in the case of the last Paiwan example, we can also have head internal relative clauses, as you can see in these two examples, both in Japanese and Korean. So even though they're not Australasian languages, and even though they could be some other kinds of, what should I say, functional phrase, but we also have this kind of cross-linguistic data supporting our core ideas here. And if my core arguments is on the right track, then I think we can also account for why we cannot have any kind of nominative WH in situ examples, not only in Paiwan, but also many kinds of Austronesian languages. So as we can see in these two languages, the nominative WH argument is basically clause initial, so it cannot stay in situ, as we can see in 13a. On the other hand, in the case of the non-nominative WH arguments, so they can and actually they must appear at their base generation position, as you can see in 13b. However, in the case of this 13b example, I mean the WH in situ example, it's actually easier for us to account for this kind of WH in situ example if we adopt Tsai's unselective binding approach about this kind of WH in situ arguments. So in other words, if we assume this kind of Q operator at the left periphery that selectively binds this WH in situ argument, then we can account for why this oblique who can stay in situ, as you can see in this 13b example. Does not have to move. On the other hand, if we follow my arguments in this presentation here, we can also account for why this nominative subject can stay in situ. It basically can stay in situ because of the relative operator that equally unselectively binds the nominative cased subject, as we can see. So in the case of this 13b example, it's quite easy for us to account for. So 14 is successfully accounted for this kind of WH in situ example. But things get complicated if a single DP has these two different kinds of features at the same time. Because this DP, if this is the case, will have to be selectively bound by two different kinds of operators at the same time, necessarily violating the relativized minimality. So if this is correct, if this kind of argument is on the right track, then this could be the reason why we can basically have any kind of nominative WH in situ examples in Paiwan and also in many other kinds of Austronesian languages. So because of this reason, Austronesian syntax must come up with some kind of other kinds of strategies to split these two different kinds of features like this. So as we can see in this structure is a pseudo-cleft structure, but if we use this kind of pseudo-cleft structure, then we can keep the WH feature within this predicate position while we keep the nominative case within the subject position. So this is probably one of the reasons why we need to use this kind of pseudo-cleft construction in many kinds of Austronesian languages, including the Paiwan examples. And if that is the case, the morphosyntactic makeups of the WH arguments will be very, very important in Austronesian languages. For example, according to my recent fieldwork on up-down Paiwan that I made last year, the nominative case was already completely incorporated to the WH argument. So in other words, they didn't have any kind of, what should I say, case-neutral form of this what, which was normal actually. So instead, they only had this kind of anma form with the perfectly incorporated nominative case. So because of this reason, they couldn't say any kind of WH in situ examples like 17. They always need to use the pseudo-cleft construction. And even though this is not a Formosan language, we can also see exactly the same patterns also in Tagalog and also many other kinds of Austronesian languages. So in the case of Tagalog, the Tagalog who and what already have incorporated the nominative case, as you can see in these two examples. And because of this reason, they cannot stay in situ, as we can see in the B examples, because this kind of configuration will necessarily violate the relativized minimality. So because of this reason, the WH arguments must be used as the predicates of the so-called pseudo-cleft construction. And this is the last piece of evidence that I have to support my core idea today. So that is my kind of conclusion of my presentation. Thank you.